I want to know what you were really doing in Fallujah, Sergeant. Colonel Matthews leaned back in his metal chair, the fluorescent light casting shadows across his weathered face. Around the conference table, 5 other officers stared at me with a mixture of skepticism and barely concealed amusement. They'd already made their minds up about me. Another black soldier trying to inflate his service record. Another ghetto kid who'd probably exaggerated everything in his file. They kept glancing at each other when they thought I wasn't looking, sharing those knowing smiles that said they'd heard it all before. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. I sit in my small apartment in Detroit now, 63 years old with gray stubble and hands that shake when it rains. The morning coffee has gone cold while I've been staring at the framed photograph on my mantel. 5 Marines in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning like we owned the world. We were young then, invincible, convinced we'd make it home with nothing more than good stories and better friendships. 3 of us made it back. The coffee tastes bitter now, like everything else some days. Outside my window I can hear the rumble of traffic on 8 Mile Road, car horns honking in the distance, life moving forward while I remain stuck in moments that happened 20 years ago. The walls of my apartment are thin, and Mrs. Rodriguez next door is arguing with her grandson about his grades again. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, but they still make me flinch sometimes. Combat does that to you. Rewires your brain so that every unexpected noise becomes a potential threat. Every shadow a place where death might be hiding. But this morning, it's not the traffic or the arguments that have stirred up the memories. It's the letter from the Marine Corps sitting unopened on my kitchen table, official seal intact, return address that reads, Department of Defense, Awards and Decorations Board. After all these years, they want to review my case again. The weight of that envelope feels heavier than any pack I carried through Iraqi streets. Some battles, it seems, never really end. The memory started creeping back last night when a police helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight cutting through my bedroom curtains like the spotlights we used during night raids in Iraq. I was lying in bed, trying to read a paperback novel about a detective in Chicago, when I heard those rotor blades cutting through the air. The sound hit me like a punch to the chest, and suddenly I wasn't in Detroit anymore. I was back in the desert, sand in my teeth, sweat burning my eyes, radio chatter crackling in my earpiece. The book fell from my hands as my heart started racing. That familiar surge of adrenaline that still comes unbidden after all these years. My doctor calls it PTSD, gives me pills that make me drowsy, tells me to attend group therapy sessions where other veterans sit in circles and try to explain the unexplainable. But some memories don't fade with medication or talking. Some memories live in your bones, in the space between heartbeats, in the moment between sleep and waking when your mind hasn't yet remembered that the war is over. I got up, walked to the kitchen, and saw that letter waiting for me like an old ghost refusing to stay buried. My hands trembled as I picked it up, not from age but from something deeper. Something that starts in the marrow and works its way out. The paper was crisp, official, but I couldn't bring myself to break that seal. Not yet. Because once I opened it, I'd have to face what happened in that courtroom 20 years ago, when they questioned my honor, and I had to prove I wasn't just another lie told by a system trying to make itself look good. Camp Ramadi was a collection of concrete barriers, razor wire, and desperate hope stretched across a patch of Iraqi desert that felt like the edge of the world. The air tasted of diesel fuel and dust, with an undertone of something burning that we could never quite identify. Our squad had been there for 6 months, long enough for the excitement to wear off and the reality to sink in. We were part of the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, tasked with clearing insurgent strongholds in what command euphemistically called contested areas. What they meant was places where death waited around every corner, where children might wave at you in the morning and plant IEDs in the afternoon, where the line between friend and enemy shifted like the desert sand. My call sign was Bookworm, a name I'd earned not because I was weak or studious, but because I'd been caught reading Langston Hughes poetry during a brief lull between patrols. In the Marines, being different was often seen as being weak, and being weak was the one thing you couldn't afford to be. I was different in more ways than one. I was quiet when others were loud, thoughtful when others were reactive, and I carried the weight of growing up in Detroit's East Side, where survival meant being smarter and tougher than everyone expected you to be. But in Iraq, those streets seemed like a distant memory, a different kind of war fought with different rules. Here, the enemy wore no uniform, spoke a language I didn't understand, and could disappear into crowds or buildings like smoke. Here, being different might just get you killed. Or worse, get your brothers killed. And that was a burden I wasn't sure I was strong enough to carry. The first time Corporal Jennings called me, "Boy," Tree, I thought I'd misheard him. We were cleaning our rifles in the armory tent, the familiar ritual of breaking down the M16, cleaning each component with the precision that had been drilled into us at Parris Island. Jennings was from somewhere in Alabama, tall and lanky with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He had a way of speaking that sounded friendly on the surface but carried an undertone of something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Hand me that cleaning rod, boy," he said, not looking up from his weapon. The other Marines in the tent kept working, but I could feel a shift in the atmosphere, like the moment before lightning strikes. I handed him the rod without saying a word, but something inside me coiled tight. I'd heard that word before, growing up in Detroit, but it had been hurled at me by strangers, people whose opinions didn't matter. Here, it was coming from someone I was supposed to trust with my life, someone whose safety I was responsible for in return. I wanted to say something, to call him out, but we were in Iraq, in a war zone where unit cohesion could mean the difference between coming home alive or in a body bag. So I swallowed my anger and kept cleaning my rifle, the metal components suddenly feeling heavier in my hands. Later that night, lying on my cot and staring at the canvas ceiling of our tent, I wondered if this was how it was going to be for the next 6 months. I wondered if I would have to choose between my dignity and my brothers' lives, and I prayed that God would give me the strength to find another way. The tension escalated over the following weeks like water coming to a slow boil. Jennings had allies in our squad, Corporal Davis from Tennessee and Lance Corporal Mitchell from rural Georgia, men who seemed to find humor in small humiliations and casual cruelties. During chow time, they'd make comments about urban recruitment standards and wonder aloud if I'd ever seen a farm before joining the Corps. When we received care packages from home, they'd joke about whether mine contained watermelon or fried chicken, their laughter echoing through the tent like fingernails on a chalkboard. I kept my mouth shut and my focus on the mission, but I could feel my patience wearing thin like a rope under constant tension. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, our squad leader, was a good Marine from El Paso who'd earned his stripes in Afghanistan, but he was dealing with bigger problems than personality conflicts. The insurgent attacks were intensifying, intelligence was unreliable, and command was pressuring us to produce results in an environment where success was hard to define and even harder to achieve. When I tried to talk to him about the situation with Jennings, he looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Handle it like a Marine. Williams, we're all under stress here." I knew what he meant. Keep your head down, do your job, don't rock the boat. But the boat was already rocking, and I was starting to feel like I was the only one trying to keep it from capsizing. The worst part wasn't the words or the looks or even the isolation. The worst part was wondering if they would have my back when it mattered, if their prejudice would make them hesitate for just a fraction of a second when my life hung in the balance. In combat, a fraction of a second is eternity. The night before our next patrol, the camp fell into that peculiar quiet that comes before significant operations. The generators hummed their monotonous song. Occasional radio chatter crackled from the command post, And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the Iraqi moon. I was sitting on the sandbags outside our tent, field stripping my sidearm by muscle memory, when Lance Corporal Thompson sat down beside me. Thompson was from Chicago, a straight shooter who'd been friendly but careful not to get too involved in the growing tension within our squad. He was quiet for a long time, just smoking a cigarette and staring out at the perimeter wire. Finally, he spoke without looking at me. "You know they're planning something, right?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Jennings and his boys. They've been talking about how to test your commitment to the Corps during tomorrow's patrol." I kept working on my pistol, but my hands had stopped moving. "What kind of test?" Thompson flicked his cigarette butt into the darkness. "The kind that might get you killed if you're not ready for it." He stood up and headed back toward the tent, then paused and looked back at me. "For what it's worth, Williams, you're a better Marine than any of them. Just watch your six tomorrow." I sat there for another hour, reassembling my weapon and thinking about my father, who'd served in Vietnam and come home to a country that didn't want him. He'd never talked much about his war, but sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window with the same expression I probably wore now. The look of a man trying to figure out how to survive enemies on both sides of the line. The patrol started before dawn, 6 Marines moving through the empty streets of a neighborhood called Al-Anbar that had been quiet for 2 weeks. Too quiet, according to our intelligence reports. We were investigating reports of weapons caches and possible insurgent activity, standard search and clear operations that had become routine, despite never feeling routine. I was walking point, which meant I was responsible for spotting IEDs, ambush sites, and any other threats before they could engage the squad. It was a position of trust, one that required the full confidence of every Marine behind me. But as we moved through the narrow alleyways between mud brick houses, I could feel eyes on my back that weren't scanning for threats. Jennings was behind me, followed by Davis and Mitchell, and their presence felt more dangerous than any insurgent hiding in the shadows. The morning air was still cool, carrying the scent of cooking fires and something else, that metallic smell that meant trouble was coming. Children watched us from doorways, their dark eyes tracking our movement with the wariness of those who'd seen too much war. An old woman in a black hijab emerged from her house to shake out a rug, saw us, and quickly retreated inside, closing the door with a finality that made my skin crawl. This was supposed to be a routine patrol, but routine patrols had a way of becoming anything but routine in Iraq. I checked my watch. So 547 hours. The sun was starting to rise over the eastern horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood. In a few minutes, we'd reached the target building where intelligence suggested we'd find weapons or insurgents or both. But as we approached the next intersection, I realized we might find something else entirely. The moment when my brothers decided whether I was worth saving or whether the color of my skin made me expendable. Then the first explosion tore through the morning silence, and everything changed. The blast came from our left flank, an IED hidden in a pile of rubble that detonated as Mitchell passed it. The concussion knocked me to the ground, my ears ringing, dust and debris raining down like deadly snow. Through the smoke and chaos, I could see Mitchell on the ground, blood spreading across his uniform, his leg bent at an impossible angle. "Contact left! Contact left!" I shouted into my radio, but my voice sounded muffled and distant. AK-47 fire erupted from multiple positions, windows, rooftops, alleyways, the distinctive crack of Kalashnikov rounds splitting the air around us. We'd walked into a carefully prepared ambush, and now we were pinned down in a kill zone with nowhere to run. I rolled behind a concrete barrier and returned fire, my M16 bucking against my shoulder as I tried to identify muzzle flashes in the windows above. Jennings was screaming into his radio, calling for backup and air support, his voice cracking with panic. Davis was dragging Mitchell toward cover, leaving a trail of blood in the sand. And in that moment, as bullets whined overhead and death reached out for us from every direction. I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I saw 3 insurgents moving to flank our position, trying to get behind us where they could finish us off. Without hesitation, I broke cover and ran toward them, drawing their fire away from my wounded brother. It didn't matter that Mitchell was part of Jennings' crew. Didn't matter that they'd spent weeks making my life miserable. He was a Marine, and Marines don't leave Marines behind. That's the only code that matters when the shooting starts. I moved through that street like something out of a fever dream, muscle memory and training taking over where conscious thought failed. The insurgents had positioned themselves behind a low wall about 50 meters from our squad's position, and they were preparing to advance. I could see them clearly now. 3 men in loose-fitting clothes, faces wrapped in keffiyehs, handling their weapons with the familiarity of those who'd been fighting for years. They were focused on the main group, hadn't seen me breaking left through the side alley. My father had told me once that war wasn't about being brave. It was about doing what needed to be done when being afraid was the smart response. I was afraid, terrified actually, but I was also angry. Angry at Jennings for his casual cruelty, angry at Mitchell for bleeding out in the street, angry at a world that made boys into soldiers and soldiers into casualties. I reached the end of the alley and took a knee behind a crumbling wall, steadying my rifle and taking aim. The first insurgent was about to expose himself to take a shot at Davis. I centered my crosshairs on his chest and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked, the man fell, and his companion spun around to find me. For a moment we stared at each other across 30 feet of dusty street, each side knowing that only some of us would walk away from this. Then I was moving again. Fire and movement, the way they'd taught us at Camp Pendleton. Cover and concealment, controlled bursts, always keep moving. The remaining 2 insurgents opened up with everything they had, bullets chipping concrete around my position, but I was already gone, rolling to a new position, acquiring new targets. This wasn't about hate or anger anymore. This was about mathematics. Them or us, kill or be killed. Survival reduced to its most basic equation. When the shooting stopped, 2 insurgents lay dead, and one had fled into the maze of side streets that honeycombed the neighborhood. I was crouched behind a shot-up sedan, my rifle barrel smoking, adrenaline making everything sharp and clear and strangely quiet. In the distance, I could hear the approaching roar of helicopter rotors, our backup finally arriving, too late to prevent the ambush, but in time to evacuate our wounded. I keyed my radio and called out, "Area secure. 2 enemy KIA. 1 escaped on foot heading northwest. See." Then I ran back to where my squad was still taking sporadic sniper fire from a building across the street. Jennings was pressed against a wall, his face pale and streaked with dust, trying to coordinate our extraction while keeping his head down. When he saw me approaching, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper that I couldn't quite identify. "Where the hell have you been, Williams?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its usual edge. I dropped down beside him and checked my ammunition. "Taking care of business, Corporal. Mitchell's stable, but we need to get him to the LZ." Davis looked up from where he was applying pressure to Mitchell's wounds and nodded at me. "Good shooting, Bookworm. You probably saved our lives." It was the first time any of them had used my call sign without mockery, and for a brief moment I thought maybe things would be different between us. But change, I was learning, comes slowly to some hearts, and old prejudices die harder than enemy soldiers. The evacuation went smoothly after that. The helicopters took Mitchell to the field hospital where Army surgeons would spend 6 hours putting his leg back together, and the rest of us returned to base camp to file our after-action reports and try to process what had happened. That night, as I was cleaning my rifle and reflecting on the day's events, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached my cot. He sat down on the footlocker across from me and was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the dim light of the tent. "Jennings says you acted without orders today," he finally said. Says you broke formation and engaged the enemy on your own initiative." I met his gaze steadily. "I saw a threat to the squad, Sergeant. I neutralized it." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "And that's what I'm putting in my report. But there's something else. Something I need to tell you." He glanced around the tent to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "Before we deployed, Jennings came to me with concerns about having you in the squad. Said he'd heard things about urban recruits, about reliability under fire." My hands stopped moving on my rifle. "What did you tell him, Sergeant?" Rodriguez smiled grimly. "I told him that Marines are Marines, regardless of where they come from. But today proved something that I already knew. Courage doesn't have a color, and character isn't determined by the neighborhood you grew up in." He stood up and started to walk away, then paused. "One more thing, Williams. There's a reason they call you Bookworm, and it's not just about the poetry. You think before you act, you see things others miss, and you understand that being a Marine is about more than just following orders. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like that's a weakness." That night, I wrote a letter to my father that I would never send, telling him about the ambush and what it had taught me about myself, and about the complex nature of brotherhood in wartime. But the real revelation came 3 days later, when I least expected it. I was walking back from the shower trailer, towel around my waist, when I heard voices from inside our tent. Through the canvas, I could make out Jennings talking to someone. "Davis," I thought, in hushed tones. "I've been thinking about what happened out there," Jennings was saying. "When Williams broke left to engage those insurgents, he didn't have to do that. Could have stayed in cover and let us handle it ourselves." There was a pause, then Davis's voice. "But if he had, Mitchell might be dead right now, and maybe the rest of us too." Another pause, longer this time. "Yeah, I know," Jennings said finally. "That's what's been eating at me. I've been wrong about him, haven't I?" I stood outside that tent for 10 minutes, listening to the most honest conversation I'd ever heard from Corporal Jennings. He talked about growing up in Alabama, about the things his father had taught him about race and difference, about how joining the Marines was supposed to be about leaving that old world behind, but how hard it was to actually do it. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "I don't know how to take back the things I've said and done." Davis was quiet for a moment. "Maybe you start by admitting you were wrong. Maybe you start by treating him like the Marine he's proven himself to be." When I finally entered the tent, both men looked up at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not quite embarrassment, not quite respect, but something in between. Something that felt like the beginning of truth. Jennings cleared his throat and looked directly at me for the first time in weeks. "Williams," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you my life." It wasn't much, but it was a start. The attack on our convoy happened 2 weeks later, just as our deployment was winding down and we were all starting to think about home. We were escorting a supply column to Forward Operating Base Liberty when the road erupted beneath the lead vehicle, an improvised explosive device buried so deep that our metal detectors had missed it completely. The blast flipped the Humvee and instantly killed the driver and gunner, 2 Marines from another squad that I barely knew, but who had families and dreams and plans for after the war. Then the mortars started falling, precise and devastating, turning the open road into a killing field. We were caught in the open with minimal cover, taking coordinated fire from at least 3 directions. This wasn't a random ambush. This was a carefully planned operation designed to destroy our entire convoy. I was in the 3rd vehicle with Jennings, Davis, and 2 Marines from Headquarters Company when shrapnel from a near-miss mortar round punched through our windshield. The driver slumped forward, blood pouring from a head wound, and our vehicle careened off the road into a drainage ditch. For a moment everything was quiet, except for the ringing in my ears and the distant sound of enemy gunfire. Then Jennings was shaking my shoulder, screaming something I couldn't quite hear. I looked around and saw Davis unconscious in the back seat. his face pale and his breathing shallow. The two headquarters Marines weren't moving at all. Our radio was dead. Our vehicle was immobilized, and somewhere out in the desert, insurgents were moving to finish what they'd started. I checked my rifle, made sure I had a full magazine, and looked at Jennings. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite weeks of tension and mistrust, we were brothers in this moment, Marines facing impossible odds together. "Can you move?" I shouted over the sound of gunfire. Jennings nodded, blood running down his face from a scalp wound. "Good. We're going to get out of this, but I need you to trust me." The next 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. We were pinned down in that ditch, taking small arms fire from insurgents who were slowly closing in on our position. Davis was unconscious but breathing, and the two headquarters Marines were both dead. Jennings had a concussion and a badly sprained wrist, but he could still fight. Our situation was desperate. No radio contact, no way to call for support, and hostile forces converging on us from multiple directions. But I had noticed something during the initial attack, something that might give us a chance. The insurgents were communicating with hand signals and specific patterns of movement that I'd seen before, during my time reading tactical manuals and studying enemy behavior patterns. They were operating according to a predictable doctrine, which meant their next moves could be anticipated. I explained my observations to Jennings as we crouched in the mud and broken concrete of the drainage ditch. "They're going to try to flank us from the east," I told him, pointing toward a group of low buildings about 200 meters away. "Standard insurgent tactics: pin us down with suppressing fire from the front, while assault teams move in from the sides." Jennings looked at me with new respect. "How do you know all this?" I smiled grimly. "Because I actually paid attention during the briefings. All those times you called me bookworm? Turns out reading about tactics and enemy behavior might actually be useful in a war." For the first time since I'd known him, Jennings laughed. Not the mocking laughter I'd grown accustomed to, but genuine appreciation for irony. "So what's your plan, Sergeant?" It was the first time he'd addressed me by rank instead of my skin color, and we both noticed it. "We're going to give them exactly what they expect," I said, "and then we're going to do something they don't." What I did next would later become the subject of intense scrutiny during that court of inquiry. But in the moment, it felt like the only option available. I had noticed a pattern in the insurgent attacks. They were sophisticated, coordinated, but they followed a rigid tactical doctrine that made them predictable. More importantly, I had observed something during our patrol briefings that no one else seemed to have picked up on. These weren't ordinary insurgents. Their equipment, their communications, their level of tactical coordination suggested they were foreign fighters, possibly former military from other countries who had come to Iraq to fight American forces. This was valuable intelligence, but it was also immediately useful tactical information. Foreign fighters, in my experience, tended to be more disciplined but less flexible than local insurgents. They followed their training religiously, which meant they could be manipulated if you understood their doctrine. I explained this to Jennings as we prepared to move. "They expect us to either stay pinned down until we're overrun or to try to break contact by moving directly away from their position," I said. "But there's a third option. We attack." Jennings stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Attack? With what? We're outnumbered at least 10 to 1. I pointed to the high ground about 300 meters to our north, a rocky outcropping that dominated the entire area. "If I can get to that position, I can provide overwatch while you extract Davis and the other wounded. But more importantly, I can call in accurate fire missions once I get eyes on their positions." It was a desperate plan, but it was our only chance. Jennings would have to carry Davis to the extraction point while I drew enemy fire and tried to survive long enough to guide in air support. As I prepared to move, Jennings grabbed my arm. "Williams," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If we don't make it out of this—" I cut him off. "We're going to make it out, all of us." The run to the high ground was the longest 300 meters of my life. I broke cover and sprinted across open ground while machine gun fire chewed up the earth around my boots. Bullets whined past my head so close I could feel the displaced air, and twice I dove for cover as mortar rounds bracketed my position. But I kept moving, using every piece of tactical knowledge I'd accumulated during my years in the Corps, every lesson learned during countless training exercises and combat patrols. When I finally reached the rocky outcropping, my lungs were burning and my hands were shaking from adrenaline, but I was alive and in position. From up there, I could see the entire battlefield spread out below me like a deadly chess game. The insurgents had positioned themselves exactly where I'd predicted, and they were moving according to the same predictable patterns I'd observed. I keyed my emergency radio and began calling in grid coordinates to the air support that was finally responding to our situation. Lightning 6-1, this is Reaper 2-7. I have multiple targets, infantry in the open, requesting immediate close air support. The voice that came back was calm and professional. Reaper 2-7, Lightning 6-1. We have you on station. Identify targets and stand by for gun runs. For the next 10 minutes, I served as the eyes and voice of vengeance, guiding precision strikes that systematically destroyed the insurgent positions. Between fire missions, I provided covering fire for Jennings as he carried Davis to safety, my rifle reaching out to touch anyone who threatened my brothers. When the shooting finally stopped and the helicopters arrived to evacuate our wounded and dead, I was still on that hilltop, still scanning for threats, still protecting my Marines. It wasn't until later that I learned what I had really accomplished that day. Not just tactical success, but something much more important. I climbed down from that rocky position as the sun was setting over the Iraqi desert, casting long shadows across a battlefield that had fallen silent. The helicopters had taken our wounded to safety, and a quick reaction force had secured the area while intelligence personnel examined the insurgent positions I had helped destroy. My uniform was torn and stained with blood, some of it mine from cuts and scrapes sustained during my sprint across open ground, but most of it from carrying wounded Marines to the landing zone. As I walked back toward our rally point, I saw Jennings sitting on the running board of a damaged Humvee, his head in his hands. When he looked up and saw me approaching, something in his expression made me pause. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. It was something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or the dawning understanding of how wrong he had been about so many things. He stood up slowly, favoring his injured leg, and walked toward me. When we were face to face, he extended his hand. Not the casual acknowledgement that Marines give each other in passing, but the firm, honest handshake of two men who had shared something that changed them both. "I owe you more than my life," he said quietly. "I owe you an education." I shook his hand and looked into his eyes. Really looked, probably for the first time since we'd met. What I saw there surprised me. Shame, yes, but also a kind of determination that I hadn't expected. "We all learn," I told him. "That's what Marines do." But even as I said it, I knew that some lessons come too late, and some damage can never be fully repaired. The next morning, we would fly back to Camp Ramadi, and a week after that, we would board a transport plane bound for the United States. But first, there was one more surprise waiting for me. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found me that evening as I was writing in my journal, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant. He sat down beside me on the sandbags and lit a cigarette, staring out at the desert that had tested us all in ways we hadn't expected. "Williams," he said finally, "there's something you need to know about today. Something about what you accomplished up on that hill." I closed my journal and waited. Rodriguez took a long drag from his cigarette before continuing. "The intelligence boys have been going through the equipment and documents we recovered from those insurgent positions. Turns out you were right. They weren't local fighters. They were foreign nationals, probably from Syria and Iran, with connections to some pretty significant terrorist networks. He paused and looked at me directly. What you did today didn't just save our squad. You helped break up a major insurgent operation that had been planning attacks on American forces for months. I felt a strange mix of pride and exhaustion wash over me. I was just doing my job, Sergeant. Rodriguez laughed, but it wasn't entirely pleasant. That's exactly what I told Colonel Matthews when he called an hour ago. But apparently that's not how everyone sees it. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Rodriguez crushed out his cigarette and sighed. It seems that Corporal Jennings filed an initial report before he understood what had really happened. A report that questioned your actions during the convoy attack suggested that you had acted recklessly and endangered the squad. I stared at him in disbelief. But that's not. I know it's not true, Rodriguez interrupted. Jennings knows it's not true. Hell, even Davis knows it's not true, and he was unconscious for most of it. But that report is already working its way up the chain of command, and there are people above us who are looking for any excuse to question the combat effectiveness of Marines like you. Like me. Marines like me. I understood what he meant, and it made me sick to my stomach. The flight home was supposed to be a celebration, a time for reflection and relief that we had survived our deployment and were returning to families and friends and normal lives. But for me, it was overshadowed by the knowledge that my actions in Iraq were under investigation, that my service record would be scrutinized by people who had never heard a shot fired in anger, but who would judge my courage based on second-hand reports and institutional bias. Jennings had tried to withdraw his initial report, had filed a corrected statement that accurately described what had happened, and acknowledged that my actions had saved lives. But bureaucracy, like hatred, has its own momentum, and once set in motion, it's difficult to stop. During the long flight across the Atlantic, I stared out the window at clouds and ocean, and tried to make sense of what service meant in a country that proclaimed equality while practicing discrimination, that sent men like me to fight its wars while questioning our loyalty and competence. 3 rows behind me, Jennings sat with Davis and some of the other Marines from our squad, and occasionally I would catch him looking in my direction with an expression I couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe, or sorrow, or the dawning realization that some mistakes can never be fully corrected. When we landed at Camp Pendleton, there were families waiting, wives and children and parents eager to welcome their heroes home. I watched through the terminal window as my squad brothers were embraced by loved ones, and I thought about my father, who had chosen not to come to California for reasons I understood but still resented. He would be waiting for me in Detroit, where we could talk about the war in private, away from the ceremonies and celebrations that never quite captured the truth of what we had experienced overseas. But first, there would be debriefings and paperwork, and eventually, a formal investigation into my conduct during our final mission. The Court of Inquiry convened 6 months after our return, in a sterile conference room at Marine Corps Base Quantico that smelled of industrial carpet and bureaucratic indifference. I sat at a long table facing 5 officers whose combined combat experience probably totaled less than half of what I had accumulated during my single deployment to Iraq. They had read reports, studied maps, and consulted with experts, but they had never crouched in a drainage ditch while mortar rounds fell around them, never made split-second decisions that would determine who lived and who died. Colonel Matthews, the presiding officer, was a career administrator who had spent most of his service in staff positions, and his questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how combat actually worked. "Sergeant Williams," he said, consulting his notes, "according to the initial report filed by Corporal Jennings, you abandoned your assigned position and engaged enemy forces without authorization from your squad leader. Can you explain this apparent breach of military discipline?" Around the table, the other officers leaned forward slightly, their faces showing the kind of skeptical attention that suggested they had already made up their minds. I had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed my responses, and gathered supporting documentation, but nothing could have prepared me for the casual dismissal in their voices, the assumption that my version of events was probably embellished or entirely fictional. "Sir," I began, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, "I observed enemy forces maneuvering to flank our position and endanger the lives of my fellow Marines. I took action to neutralize that threat and protect my squad." Colonel Matthews nodded as if he had expected this response. "And yet Corporal Jennings reports that your actions were reckless and potentially endangered the entire squad. How do you reconcile these conflicting accounts?" It was at that moment that the door to the conference room opened, and Captain Sarah Mitchell entered with an expression of barely controlled fury. I had never seen her before, but the silver oak leaves on her collar and the combat action ribbon on her chest immediately commanded attention from everyone in the room. She carried a thick folder of documents and moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to getting things done. "Gentlemen," she said without preamble, "I'm here regarding the Sergeant Williams investigation, and I have information that this panel needs to hear before proceeding." Colonel Matthews looked annoyed at the interruption. "Captain, this is a closed proceeding, unless you have been specifically assigned to this case." "I have been assigned, sir, by General Harrison's office, after they reviewed the intelligence reports from Sergeant Williams' actions in Iraq." She opened her folder and began distributing documents to each member of the panel. "What you're reading are classified after-action reports, intelligence assessments, and recommendations for decorations that somehow never made it into Sergeant Williams's official record." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the officers read. I watched their faces change from skeptical dismissal to surprise to something approaching embarrassment. Captain Mitchell continued speaking as they read. "Sergeant Williams didn't just save his squad during that convoy attack. His tactical observations and fire direction resulted in the destruction of a major insurgent cell that had been responsible for 17 previous attacks on American forces. His actions prevented what intelligence estimates suggest would have been dozens of additional American casualties." "Narir," she paused and looked directly at Colonel Matthews. "The initial report questioning his conduct was filed by Corporal Jennings, who has since submitted 3 separate statements recanting his original assessment and requesting that Sergeant Williams be recommended for the Silver Star." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Colonel Matthews cleared his throat and shuffled through the papers Captain Mitchell had provided, his face flushing slightly as he read. "Captain, this is quite different from the information we were provided initially." Captain Mitchell's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could sense the steel beneath her calm exterior. "Yes, sir. It appears there were some significant gaps in the documentation provided to this panel." She turned to address the entire group. "Gentlemen, what we have here is a case study in how institutional bias can corrupt the evaluation process. Sergeant Williams' actions in Iraq were nothing short of exemplary, yet he finds himself before a court of inquiry based on a report that was immediately recanted by its author." She pulled out another document and placed it on the table. "This is a statement from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Sergeant Williams's squad leader, detailing the harassment and discrimination that Sergeant Williams endured throughout his deployment and how he consistently responded to that treatment with professionalism and dignity." The officers around the table were no longer looking at me with skepticism. Some looked embarrassed, others appeared angry. Whether at the situation or at being placed in this position, I couldn't tell. Captain Mitchell wasn't finished. "I've also spoken with every surviving member of Sergeant Williams' squad, including Corporal Jennings, who specifically requested that I convey his deep regret for the role his initial report played in bringing Sergeant Williams before this panel." She looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. "Corporal Jennings asked me to tell you, Sergeant Williams, that he considers you the finest Marine he has ever served with, and that he will spend the rest of his life making amends for his initial failure to recognize your courage and character." The words hit me harder than I had expected, and for a moment I couldn't trust myself to speak. Colonel Matthews was studying the documents with increasing discomfort, occasionally glancing up at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Sergeant Williams," Colonel Matthews said finally, his voice noticeably different from the skeptical tone he had used earlier, "it appears that this panel owes you an apology. The investigation into your conduct was based on incomplete and inaccurate information." He set down the papers and looked directly at me. "Not only were your actions in Iraq completely justified, they were heroic by any reasonable standard. You saved the lives of your fellow Marines and significantly damaged enemy operations in your area of responsibility." I sat quietly, waiting to see where this would lead. Around the table, the other officers were reviewing the documents with expressions of growing embarrassment and, in some cases, what looked like shame. "Furthermore," Colonel Matthews continued, "it's clear that the discrimination you faced during your deployment was completely unacceptable and should have been addressed by your chain of command." Captain Mitchell stepped forward. "Sir, if I may, General Harrison has asked me to inform this panel that the Marine Corps takes these findings very seriously. There will be a comprehensive review of how this case was handled, and steps will be taken to ensure that similar situations don't occur in the future." She turned to me again. "Sergeant Williams, the General has also asked me to inform you that you are being recommended for the Silver Star for your actions during the convoy attack, and the Bronze Star with Combat V for your overall service in Iraq." The room fell silent again. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake wondering if my service mattered. If my sacrifices meant anything to a corps that seemed more interested in protecting its image than supporting its Marines. "Thank you, Captain," I said quietly. "But I didn't do anything that any other Marine wouldn't have done." Colonel Matthews shook his head. "With respect, Sergeant, that's not true. What you did required not just courage, but the kind of moral strength that allows a person to protect those who have wronged them. That's not common, and it deserves recognition." I sit in my apartment in Detroit now, 20 years later, holding that letter from the Department of Defense that I finally opened this morning. It's an invitation to attend a ceremony at the Pentagon, where they want to present me with a medal I should have received 2 decades ago. The Silver Star, they say, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States. The language is formal, bureaucratic, but I can read between the lines. Someone, somewhere, finally decided that justice delayed is still justice, even if it comes wrapped in apology and administrative embarrassment. The medal itself doesn't matter much to me anymore. I've learned that true honor isn't something that gets pinned to your chest. It's something you carry inside yourself, tested and proven in moments when no one is watching and the only witness is your own conscience. But the letter represents something important. Acknowledgement that what happened to me in Iraq and in that conference room at Quantico was wrong, and that the Marine Corps is finally ready to admit it. I think about Jennings sometimes, wonder if he ever found peace with what happened between us. Captain Mitchell told me that he had left the Corps and become a teacher, that he'd married a woman from Detroit, of all places, and was raising 2 children to be better than their father had been. Change is possible, I learned, but it comes slowly and at great cost, and sometimes the people who need it most resist it the longest. Davis stayed in the Marines and eventually became a sergeant major, retiring after 30 years of service. We exchange Christmas cards now, awkward notes that never quite capture what we shared in that Iraqi desert, but acknowledge that some bonds transcend time and distance. The other Marines from our squad scattered to civilian jobs and normal lives, carrying pieces of that deployment with them like shrapnel that never fully works its way out. The war took things from all of us, innocence, certainly, and the comfortable belief that good intentions guarantee just outcomes. It taught us that heroism and hatred can exist in the same heart, that courage and cowardice are often separated by nothing more than circumstances and choice. Mitchell, the Marine who lost his leg in that first ambush, retired on disability and moved back to Georgia, where he started a foundation that helps disabled veterans find employment and housing. He sends me updates occasionally, pictures of veterans he's helped get back on their feet, stories of second chances and new beginnings. In his last letter, he wrote something that stuck with me. "That day in Iraq, you saved my life. But more than that, you showed me what it means to be a Marine. Not the recruiting poster version, but the real thing. Someone who puts the welfare of others above their own safety, regardless of how those others have treated them." The physical wounds from Iraq have mostly healed, but the psychological ones require constant attention. I still wake up sometimes to the sound of helicopters, still tense when I hear loud noises or see groups of young men moving with military bearing. My doctor says this is normal, that trauma leaves neurological pathways that can be managed but never completely erased. I attend group therapy sessions now, not because I have to, but because I want to. Because talking to other veterans helps me understand that my experiences weren't unique, that the military has always struggled with issues of race and fairness and justice. We're getting better, slowly, but progress in large institutions comes in generations rather than years, and there are still young Marines today facing the same challenges I faced in Iraq. The lesson I learned in Iraq wasn't about warfare or tactics or even courage, though I learned about all of those things. The lesson was about the corrosive power of prejudice and the redemptive potential of grace. When I chose to save Jennings and the others despite how they had treated me, I wasn't being heroic. I was being human. I was recognizing that dignity isn't something that can be taken away by others. It's something that can only be surrendered by ourselves. Every day, we face choices about how to respond to injustice, whether to meet hatred with hatred or to find some other way forward. The easy choice is revenge, the satisfaction of proving that you're better than those who doubted you by watching them fail. The harder choice is grace, protecting those who have wronged you, not because they deserve it, but because that's who you choose to be. I chose grace in Iraq not because I was a saint, but because I was a Marine, and Marines protect Marines, period. No qualifications, no exceptions, no matter how much it hurts or how unfair it seems. That code saved my life more than once during my deployment, and it saved my soul every day after. In a world that too often rewards cruelty and punishes compassion, choosing grace is an act of rebellion, a declaration that humanity is stronger than hatred, and that love, however difficult, is more powerful than fear. I learned that lesson in the desert of Iraq, reinforced it in a conference room at Quantico, and try to live it every day in the streets of Detroit. Some lessons are worth the pain they cost to learn. The late afternoon sun slants through my apartment window now, casting long shadows across the floor where dust motes dance in golden light. On my kitchen table, beside that letter from the Pentagon, sits a framed photograph. The same one I was looking at this morning, 5 Marines in desert camouflage with our arms around each other's shoulders. We look so young in that picture, so sure of ourselves and our place in the world. 3 of us made it home, but all of us were changed by what we experienced together in that distant desert. I've decided to attend the ceremony at the Pentagon, not because I need their recognition, but because I want to represent something important. The thousands of Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen who served with honor despite facing discrimination, who chose dignity over bitterness, who proved that heroism has no color. My father won't be there. He died 5 years ago, quietly in his sleep, never having talked much about his war, but having lived its lessons every day. But I'll carry his memory with me, along with the memories of all the Marines who trusted me with their lives and whom I trusted with mine. In the end, that's what service means. Not the medals or the ceremonies or the speeches, but the quiet knowledge that when it mattered most, you stood up for something larger than yourself. That when the shooting started and the easy choices disappeared, you chose to protect rather than to punish, to build rather than to destroy, to be worthy of the trust that others placed in you. The medal they want to give me belongs as much to Jennings and Davis and Mitchell as it does to me, because courage is not a solo performance. It's a duet played between people who choose to see the humanity in each other, despite every reason to look away. If that story found you at the right moment, tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes, sharing difficult memories helps carry the weight. And if you know someone who needs to hear that change is possible, that grace is stronger than hatred. That service means something deeper than glory. Share this story with them. Because in the end, we're all just trying to figure out how to be worthy of the trust that others place in us. And sometimes the hardest battles are fought not against enemies in distant lands, but against the prejudices and fears that live in our own hearts.